go for it.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar regarding the City of Quincy's Housing Production Plan. My name is Sean Glennon, and I am the City of Quincy's Community Development Director. I'm joined by Sherry Zoe, who was the city's Housing Programs Manager, and we both work in the city's Department of Planning and Community Development. Presenting this evening is Emma Battaglia, who was the Senior Housing and Land Use Planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, or MAPC, which is a designated regional planning agency for our area. MAPC is assisting the City of Quincy and our advisory committee with the development of this plan. Also with us tonight is Lydia Slocum, who was a regional housing and land use planner with MAPC. The public engagement process for this plan started in December 2021 with what we called an online open house, consisting of a self-paced presentation and survey exercise. Also in December, we held our first webinar at which we talked about what a housing production plan is. We discussed existing housing conditions, and we solicited feedback from participants with respect to the vision and priorities of this new housing production plan. Since then, the city and/or MAPC has facilitated numerous focus groups and targeted interviews. We have participated in news programs at Quincy Access Television. We have released multiple social media posts and press releases, and we have held 4 advisory committee meetings. The advisory committee is a 9-member group, which includes Sherry and me, as well as other staff from the city's Department of Planning and Community Development, representatives from local housing community, community housing organizations, or CHODOs, and representatives from the city's Affordable Housing Trust Committee. And last but not least, we offered a second online open house and digital engagement opportunity earlier this month. So the purpose of this webinar this evening is to present the goals, strategies, and action steps that have been recommended by stakeholders, which includes members of the public. And we also will talk about possible locations and types of housing where additional development might make sense over the next 5 years. We will offer an opportunity for folks to ask questions, and we'll end with a brief discussion on next steps. So again, thank you for your attendance and participation this evening. And I'll now turn it over to Emma to begin the formal presentation.
Thank you, Sean. Sean already went through our agenda for tonight, but here it is again. We'll just give you some background about the process first, go into the recommendations that we are looking at and have been vetted by the public, and we will then get into some housing locations and types that we've received some feedback on. And then lastly, we'll have some time for the Q&A. So just to let you all know that this meeting is being recorded. That is so we can share the recording and the presentation after this meeting with anybody who isn't able to join us in live time. Everyone should be muted with their videos off. If you have a question, we ask that you put it in the Q&A box, which should be on your screen. And if something is straightforward or simple, we can try to answer it in real time, but we'll try to go through those questions at the end, and any more complicated questions that require more response, we'll save for the Q&A portion of the forum. And I also just want to note that Mandarin Interpretation is available. So if you would like to use that, you can click the interpretation button. It should be towards the bottom of your screen. It looks sort of like a globe. Sean has already introduced himself and me, but I just want to have another call out. We talk very often sort of through all of the elements of this housing production plan process, and also to review feedback that we've gotten and to facilitate all of these meetings that we have hosted through this process. So I just want to thank Sean and Sherry for being great project leads, and I, as Sean introduced, am Emma Battaglia. I'm a senior housing and land use planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Sean also introduced the advisory committee and the role that they play in this process. I just wanted to give another shout out to the folks that are on this committee, and they've been a really integral part of sort of representing different community interests and making sure that, the things that we are analyzing and recommending, are right for the city of Quincy. Just to give you a little bit of background about MEPC, we are the regional planning authority for the greater Boston area. We serve the 101 cities and towns in and around Boston through different kinds of planning processes like this one. We have many other teams that do things not even related to housing, kind of runs the gamut. And overall, MEPC is a mission-driven organization that has a focus on smart growth, equity, and sustainability. And we really bring a regional perspective to the projects that we do, because we know that issues like housing affordability are really region-wide and they don't stop at a community's border. To give a little bit of background on what a housing production plan is, just a refresher, or for anybody who is new to this process, it is a proactive strategy that communities can take to plan for and guide future development. And this includes both market rate development and also affordable housing. And it is a process to help the community come together, understand what their needs are, come up with goals that they want to achieve, and then more specific action items to make progress towards those goals. And the city has already completed, I think this might be the third housing production plan that the city has done. The last one was released in 2016. The overall components of a housing production plan, these are set in the state statute, which regulates housing production plans. And they need to first understand what the housing needs are, what the demand for housing is in the community. From there, making sort of broad general goals about what the community wants its housing conditions to be like. And we look specifically at development constraints, both from a policy aspect, so looking at zoning, but also, from a physical standpoint, things like sea level rise or open space, anything that, are locations that we want to think, we really want to think critically about when we recommend any locations. We have to identify specific opportunities for housing development, specific sites, and then we come up with strategies. These can be policies, programs that help us to achieve these goals. We also make some production targets in terms of the number of market rate and affordable units that we are hoping to achieve at the end of this 5-year process, because it is a 5-year plan. Sean already mentioned some of the community engagement that we've done. Unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic, that sort of shook things up a bit. So all of our engagement has been virtual, but we have, tried to make sure to emphasize the voices of people who could most benefit from this plan. So people who can benefit from new types of housing, more affordable options, et cetera, including renters, people of color, non-English speakers, and any other underserved protected classes. So this is part of our second digital engagement campaign. We had another one back in the winter where, with both of these, we're trying to give the opportunity for people to both engage with the information and give us their feedback, while also, having opportunities like this where you can get more of an overview, meet the project team, and also ask us questions directly. We also have held some focus group meetings and targeted interviews to understand more specifically what housing needs are for different subsets of the population, to make sure that we are, keeping our focus as broad as possible. Before we get into the different recommendations, I just want to very briefly go through how we have structured them. So there are a handful of overarching goals. These are meant to be broad aspirational statements of what we want to achieve. Then we identify general activities that the city can take to implement these goals, and they might be in the form of a zoning policy change, other kinds of policy changes, direct funding, creating a new program, so they can really run the gamut depending on what your overall mission is. And then we break down those strategies even further to identify specific actions that the city, working with its partners, can undertake to try to make things happen. And so we group the action items under each strategy, but each strategy and action can impact multiple goals. So before I get into what we have presented, what we presented to the community for in the online open house, I first just want to give a brief overview of what we did. It was basically a kind of long range, a longer survey that really dives deep into what all the potential strategies, goals, actions are, gives some background information about what each of them was, and then we asked folks to weigh in on, how they align with their priorities, if they thought these things were a good idea for Quincy to, achieve, or maybe not, it's not such a good idea for the community. Also, just keeping in mind that this is only a 5-year plan, so there's only so much that we can do within those 5 years. So because of that, it's really important that we prioritize. We had about 150 people who filled out the online open house. And basically what I'll go through are the different recommendations that we proposed, kind of what the initial feedback we got on it, and then how we'll take it from there. First, to just very broadly summarize some of the housing needs that we heard during our first webinar and online open house, and also through the more targeted conversations that we've had, folks feel like the range of housing types that are available in the community don't quite meet the needs of all current and future residents. We've heard a lot about how housing is unaffordable to current residents, particularly folks who have lower incomes. Over the years, there's been a loss of naturally occurring affordable housing. So these are units that aren't deed restricted, they're not required to be occupied by someone who is considered low income, but they are generally affordable to what someone is able to pay. We've heard from a number of people about seniors not being able to afford to stay in their homes, but also not really be able to afford to downsize into another home, so they're kind of stuck. In particular, residents of color, new families, and people with disabilities lack housing options in the community. There are a lack of affordable home ownership options where people can, start to build equity in their home. The city has only so much capacity to support new housing initiatives. Other things we've heard are people wanting to see it focus on sustainability and climate resilience in housing, looking towards the future. We should look at more resources for owners to help maintain their homes and create, safe and healthy homes for, potential tenants. And on that note, safe and secure housing from a public safety perspective, but also just generally housing conditions. We are proposing 5 very broad goals. The first is related to creating diverse and affordable housing. What we mean by diverse is, creating units that are affordable across different ranges of incomes, and also diverse in terms of different housing typologies. So not just single family, not just large multifamily, but looking at a diverse array. So our first goal is to develop a diverse and affordable housing stock that meets the needs of current and future Quincy residents. Our second goal is around preservation and anti-displacement. And that is to preserve the affordable housing stock and protect existing residents' housing stability, especially for folks who are low income or immigrant households. Next, related to health and safety, protect and promote healthy, safe, sustainable, and climate resilient housing. Our next goal is around anti-discrimination, for the city to be a leader in anti-discrimination by affirmatively furthering fair housing obligations and especially advancing racial and economic diversity. And lastly, our goal around capacity building, how we're going to implement, the items in this plan. So identifying and building up municipal staff and also partner agencies' capacity to implement, the different strategies and actions that we've put forward in our plan. We asked folks on the online open house to tell us how much these goals reflected their priorities. And more than half of people feel like who answered this question felt like the goals reflected their priorities a great deal, with also a lot of folks, feeling like they reflected their priorities a moderate amount. So a pretty small percentage of folks who didn't feel like these goals address their priorities, which kind of reaffirms that we are hopefully on the right track with those. We asked folks to give us their feedback on the goals that we put forth, and specifically, what topics would they want to change, add, or remove. So I'll just go through these quickly. Really intentionally promoting affordability over high income market rate units, improving public safety in terms of building conditions, but also related to crime, paying attention to environmental and climate impact, and tied up with that, thinking about how we might be able to eliminate fossil fuel dependency in our new buildings. We've heard a number of people wanting to prevent increases to their property taxes, especially people who are older, who might be on a fixed income. We heard about protecting Quincy's neighborhoods and the neighborhood character and density, especially the neighborhoods that fall into the residential A district, where mostly single family is what's there. Again, we heard that people would want to specifically focus on affordable home ownership opportunities, and kind of look further into why home ownership rates might be decreasing. Another topic that was suggested was holding developers to their promises, specifically prioritizing affordable housing that would be on site. So if it's a mixed income development, making sure that those units set aside for folks with lower incomes are on the same site, in the same building, spread out as any market rate units. We heard a desire to protect middle income housing, so people who may not qualify for affordable housing but are high income and might be struggling to pay market rents. We should promote development that's focused on the community and it's really thoughtful. Another topic was around housing the homeless, improving city infrastructure to support any new housing, and also the existing housing that we have. Preserving green space, promoting dense housing near MBTA stations, encouraging good landlord practices. And we also got some good feedback with some people feeling like capacity building maybe isn't really the best goal. Now I'm going to go into the strategies we've come up with. These strategies fall under 5 main buckets. So local policies are things that, usually the city council would pass, or it could be by executive action. And usually these they don't require significant funding to implement, but sometimes depending on what the policy is, it might require state action in terms of going through the home rule legislation process. Some strategies are directly related to tax and altering property taxes or creating new taxes. Again, this is another item that often requires the state legislator to weigh in on. Something that, the city of Quincy is already doing a lot is, having programming that directly is tied to housing needs. And so these are really local interventions, usually, managed by the mayor and his staff on the executive branch, generally require some kind of funding to make them happen. Zoning adjustments are implemented at the local level, usually things are recommended by the planning board, and then the city council votes on them. And these typically require only local approval. And then lastly, a big part of it is partnerships and advocacy. So This could happen either at the local level, the regional level, sometimes the state level, and generally doesn't require a lot of money to set up, but might require funding to sustain. So these are the 7 actions, the 7 strategies that we have come up with. The first is explore amending the city zoning ordinance to better facilitate a range of new housing development. We know that single family homes make up about 1/3 of housing in Quincy, and on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of units are within large multifamily buildings. So this is getting at how do we, make it so more mid-density kind of projects can happen. So things like duplexes, townhomes, small multifamily development that might, fit well in a lower density neighborhood, as opposed to something that is very high density. Our next strategy was around supporting the creation of deed-restricted affordable housing for households earning up to Quincy's median income. So area median income is something that is tracked at the regional level, but because different communities in the area and just generally the population has a fairly high median income, a lot of units that are priced at that level to be considered affordable are not actually, and Quincy's median income is about $77,000, and so we want to specifically look at people who are making even less than what the median income is for the whole region. Next, create tools and resources to preserve Quincy's existing affordable housing stock. So this is both units that are considered deed restricted, affordable housing units that are designated to be reserved only to people who qualify, but also we're talking about some of the more naturally occurring affordable housing. So, units that are not subsidized, again, they're not required to be leased or bought by people of a certain income bracket, but generally they are affordable to folks in the community, and we're seeing less and less of those today. Next, protect residents' ability to stay in Quincy, particularly low-income, senior, and immigrant households. We know that rents and sales prices are a lot higher than people can afford, and because of that, displacement pressures are a real risk. So this focuses on stabilizing housing for residents and opening pathways for new households and existing households to stay in Quincy. Next, establish and implement resources that the city can use to protect the most vulnerable populations and fight discrimination. This is getting more at how can we impact the private real estate market, which is really where a lot of these things happen, and making sure that within the market people really have equal access to housing, which naturally does not always come. So thinking kind of proactively about that. Second and last is leverage municipal resources to ensure healthy and sustainable homes. So, this is looking at new development that might produce fewer greenhouse gases, promote public health, encourage smart growth development that could be less auto reliant because it's located near transit stations, but also, thinking about the potential risks of climate change and how that might impact existing homes in the community. And then lastly, increase the city's administration and financial capacity to implement housing production plan goals. And so, the city already has a strong and dedicated department that oversees these actions, but, really to do all the things we'd want to do, additional capacity would be desired. We asked people within the online open house to rank the strategies by their priority, and the 2 strategies that got the most votes were supporting the creation of new deed-restricted affordable housing for households earning up to Quincy's median income, and protecting residents' ability to stay in Quincy, particularly low-income, senior, and immigrant households. So those 2 were almost tied, and they had quite a few more votes than any of the other strategies. So they really rose to the top. Now I will get more specific into the different action items that fall under each of the strategies, and the feedback that we heard during the online open house about these. And, I mentioned this before, but we do need to set priorities just because there's only so much we can do in 5 years. So, there might be some items on here that are really priority that we want to focus our resources on, and others that are more just nice to have. If we get to it, that's great. But making sure that the priorities that, the public and different stakeholders have shared with us are really rising to the top. So under strategy A, around amending the city zoning ordinance, we put forth a number of actions. The first one around amending zoning to allow 2-family homes and townhomes in the residential A district, to explore that. Right now, only single family is allowed in that district. So, are there ways we can incrementally increase density while still preserving the character of those neighborhoods? Next, creating zoning rules for 3 and 4 family developments that are distinct from larger multifamily developments. Right now, whether a unit or whether a building has 3 units or 500 units, they're categorized the same. So by creating separate zoning rules for these kind of mid-density housing options, we might be able to, again, find locations where those sorts of densities are appropriate, and making it a little bit easier to build. Next, explore amending the zoning code to allow accessory dwelling units in the residential A, B, and C districts. Accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, are, another living option on a property that's separate from the primary residence. And this could be attached to the main unit. It can be detached. For example, someone has a garage that they fix up and they make, a studio apartment in there. And it's a way to sort of, again, have subtle increases in density, create, what might be more affordable options without disrupting neighborhood character. Next, amendments to dimensional requirements to allow for a range of smaller housing types that match historic development patterns. A lot of the lot sizes or setbacks, a lot of the older properties that are in the city were built before zoning. So, they wouldn't even comply. So, making it so those types of buildings that give the city a lot of character and people would want to see more of, thinking about how we kind of tailor the dimensional requirements in the zoning to those historic development patterns. Next, incentivize deeper levels of affordability and inclusionary zoning units through further density or dimensional relief. So right now, the city requires that pretty much all large developments, 10% or more of those units have to be affordable, designated affordable. There's also options instead to pay in lieu. That's a decision made by the Affordable Housing Trust. But in this action, we're thinking about beyond just, typically affordable units are at 80% of the area median income. And a lot of folks who are a lot less than that, even what's considered affordable is not really affordable. So can we create some units at even more affordable, price points by having additional density that might be able to offset some of those increased costs? Because when you're talking about deeper levels of affordability, you're really talking about that gap between what a person at that income level can afford to pay and what it actually costs on the open market, which the deeper level of affordability, the bigger that gap is. Next, using density bonuses to incentivize conversion and expansion of historic structures into small multifamily homes in order to preserve architectural heritage while producing housing. We know that some old buildings could take a lot of money to fix up, and it might be more economical to just tear it down. So thinking about how we might be able to preserve those units while also making it more financially feasible. Next, encourage mixed-use development along key smart growth corridors. Multifamily properties are allowed by right in a lot of the business districts, but mixed-use developments that have Commercial uses on the first floor and multifamily above generally require a special permit. So thinking about ways that we might be able to have less barriers to creating those kind of units in those kind of buildings, but still, having the planning board review those projects as a part of their site plan review process. So, they're not totally skating by without review to make sure that they're appropriate for the location. And then lastly, reducing parking requirements to facilitate housing development. Currently about 1.5 units are required for each unit in all zoning districts. And so are there opportunities in some of the more transit accessible areas to have potentially less parking? And we know that parking takes up potential developable space. It costs money. And also, data shows that by providing more parking, you're often you're creating more traffic because people are that induced demand is going to kick in. People know that they can park at a unit, they might be more likely to have a car. This graphic just shows the breakdown of those different action items based on how people felt they were, whether they felt they were a high priority. For some folks, an item might not be a high priority, but they still like the idea. Some items people aren't sure about. And, some items people might think that Quincy shouldn't pursue this idea. So we wanted to give people the option to weigh in on all of those things. The items that, kind of rose to the top within this strategy were promoting mixed use development along smart growth corridors and explore zoning to potentially allow 2-family homes and townhomes in the residential A district. By far, there's the least support for reducing parking requirements, which was not particularly surprising. Our next strategy is around creating new affordable housing. So thinking about ways we can first, potentially use public land for affordable housing, whether the city donates, sells, or leases it. If there's a building already on the site, potentially that can be converted or, a new building built. The next action item is around establishing a housing and land acquisition program. We know that land for affordable housing is really hard to come by and land is really expensive. So if a property does come on the market, making sure to grab that and potentially holding it for affordable housing development, or, it's something that the city could use to purchase land and existing buildings directly for use in affordable housing. In that same vein, when owners don't pay their taxes, the city often can come into possession of the property. And normally those properties are sold sometimes at auction to recoup those lost taxes. So instead, the city might be able to use those properties for new affordable housing development. The next item is around paying for deeper levels of affordability and inclusionary zoning units. I had already talked about sort of what deeper levels of affordability mean. In this case, instead of allowing a developer to have a density bonus to help subsidize those units, this could involve the city actually paying some of that gap between what an individual can pay and what the unit actually costs. Next, continue building partnerships to maximize resources for affordable housing production. The city already has some great organizations that are operating, community development organizations and nonprofit groups, so just continuing to build up those relationships. Next, waive fees for affordable housing developments. It might not go that far, but it could be just a little way to make affordable housing a little bit more financially feasible. And next, explore committing to an annual general fund appropriation and or general bond obligation for affordable housing and development. So if the city's really serious about committing, a one size, a one-time sum of money or kind of an annual thing, that is something they can consider to help fund affordable housing development and also preservation of units that might be at risk of expiring their deed restrictions. The item that had the most high priority responses is using public land for affordable housing, followed by creating a housing and land acquisition program and building and expanding partnerships for affordable housing development. One item, the paying for deeper levels of affordability, folks aren't as sure about, but generally kind of the minority of people think that Quincy shouldn't pursue these ideas. Most people feel like they are a high priority or it's something that they would like to have. The next strategy is related to tools and resources to preserve existing affordable housing. So especially units that people might be able to make those payments for right now, but the landlord raises the rent and then it becomes unaffordable. And then also thinking about those deed restricted units on the subsidized housing inventory. So that would include all the units that Quincy Housing Authority manages, but also there might be affordable units in those mixed income developments that the city is approving. The first item is to establish a small landlord rental rehab fund. So this could provide some financial assistance to landlords who agree to rent to income eligible tenants or limit annual rent increases. Next, continue and expand funding for owner occupied home renovations through the housing rehab program. The city already has a program, but there's certainly ways that additional fund could help supplement that program, or potentially, instead of that funding being given out through loans, it could be given out through grants. Next, fund and facilitate the preservation of low cost unsubsidized rental housing. So that might be by helping fund these units, but in return, having an affordable restriction placed on that unit, working to sell those units to a nonprofit who could preserve affordability. And there's other ways to do that. And then lastly, preserving existing affordable units on the subsidized housing inventory that have deed restrictions at risk of expiring. We know that there are a number of units that will expire in the next couple of years. So thinking about how we can retain those and make sure that the people living in those units are not being displaced. The most high priorities we got for this strategy were around preserving affordable units on the SHI. And also, most people feeling like the different actions put forth here are either high priority or they like the idea. Strategy D is around protecting residents' ability to stay in Quincy, particularly low income, senior and immigrant households. The first item is establish an office of housing stability. This could be a city-run office that provides support to people who are experiencing a housing crisis, are experiencing landlord harassment, just really a location for people to go to if they're having a housing issue. Next, provide direct support for seniors to stay in their homes or downsize. This could be in the form of financial assistance for home rehab or accessibility improvements, also potentially expanding the senior property tax exemption program to reduce that burden. Next, promote and expand the city's down payment assistance fund for households looking to purchase a home in Quincy, particularly targeting low home ownership rates among marginalized communities. Folks that haven't really had as much opportunity to accrue generational wealth. The city already has a first-time homebuyer program, but there are caps on the maximum sales price, which mean a lot of homes just, are not eligible for the program. Next, there are different legal mechanisms that the city can try to implement to help avoid displacement, such as a tenant right of first refusal and a just cause eviction policy. And these are, ways to help prevent landlords from evicting tenants without otherwise a breach of the lease. And again, these usually require legislature approval. And next, exploring local requirements for a notice of sale and a notice of rent increase to Quincy tenants to prevent housing instability. Oftentimes, people might not even know that their rental unit is being sold. Landlords are required to notify tenants if a unit is converted to a condo, but not if the unit is otherwise sold. So these are just ways to, increase the time in which people can find a new housing option. Next, utilize resources to expand rental assistance programs. The local nonprofit organizations that fund affordable housing and help, run programming to folks, do distribute rental assistance and also fuel assistance. So thinking about ways we can supplement that, because we hear that, the amount of funding that's needed doesn't really match the need. Also, the last item is working with partners to increase the amount of shelter, supportive, and also transitional housing opportunities in Quincy. As housing costs rise, it becomes even easier for a household to become homeless. This could happen, just someone gets sick, someone loses their job. So, thinking about ways to create more beds, but also transitional options to get out of that and into a more permanent housing solution. On this item, we had the most support for seniors to stay in their homes or downsize, followed by the notice of sale or notice of rent increase to prevent housing instability, and expanding the down payment assistance fund. Those two are tied. All right, I'm getting there. I know there's a lot of items here, so thank you for your patience. The next strategy is around resources that the city can use to protect the most vulnerable populations, such as adopting a tenant anti-harassment policy, if landlords are failing to make needed repairs, threatening to report a tenant's immigration status, either the city solicitor can get involved to enforce protections or refer to neighborhood legal services. The next item around creating equitable development principles and a scorecard for new development to try to think about ways that, community benefits are really in the equation. Next, promoting Quincy's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. The city's had one since 2021, but more can be done to promote their work and really tie that committee with some of the efforts to implement this housing production plan. The next action item is around working with a regional nonprofit to perform fair housing education and enforcement services. Really enforcing the fact that there are federal and state laws to prohibit discrimination based on race, ethnicity, age, family status, etc. The next item is around creating universal design standards to encourage the use in new housing. So this even kind of goes beyond what the ADA Act requires and is meant to create buildings that are accessible kind of across someone's lifespan. The next item is around hosting regular information sessions on different housing topics. Through this housing production plan, we're kind of having this conversation about housing, but thinking about how we might be able to continue it after the fact. And then lastly, improve partnerships and trust with Quincy's Asian community. So working with nonprofits and those organizations that are really serving the community to help build trust and more relationships. The number one item here was for high priority was a tenant anti-harassment policy, followed by promoting the DEI committee and considering integrating equitable development principles into the approval and permitting process. Strategy F is around ensuring healthy and sustainable homes. First off, addressing the sea level rise risks in affordable housing. We know that a number of the units that are owned by the Quincy Housing Authority might be at risk of flooding due to sea level rise, and also, just folks who have lower incomes but don't live in affordable housing and their properties might be at risk. So this would involve making funding available, making renovations needed to avoid potential displacement. The next item is around continuing and expanding the city's Office of Healthy Homes. The city already has this office to run the housing rehab program, the lead abatement program, and the first-time homebuyer program. So thinking about ways to further supplement those programs or create new ones. And then lastly, consider integrating baseline requirements for sustainable development into the permitting process. But trying to pay attention to not accidentally increasing housing costs, though certain things to increase energy efficiency could result in reduced fuel payments over time. The item that emerged here with the most votes was requirements for sustainable development and permitting. Expanding the Office of Healthy Homes was one of those items where most people said that they like the idea, but it's not necessarily a high priority. And then lastly, strategy G is around capacity building. The first item being to hire a housing planner to really proactively facilitate affordable housing development, monitor units that might have expiring deed restrictions, and kind of liaising with different housing partners. The next item is to create a strategic plan for the Affordable Housing Trust to implement elements of this housing production plan. The Affordable Housing Trust is active and they're doing really good work, but there might be ways to have more of a strategy for how the Affordable Housing Trust should approve projects and spend its funding. Next, formalize the practice of providing equity and cultural competency training for city staff, volunteers, and elected and appointed officials. So this, might involve specific trainings that can really help consider barriers that exist when engaging diverse communities and working to overcome them. And then lastly, creating an implementation committee to oversee the implementation of this housing production plan and to really make sure that things that we prioritize here are able to happen. The most popular item here was around the cultural competency training, but generally compared to some of the other strategies, there were, the least people feeling like these things were high priorities in comparison to some other action items. And here are the highest priority action items that emerged across the board. So these are things we really want to think about how we can prioritize over the next 5 years. The numbers are kind of wonky because some of these were ties. So tied for first place was providing direct support for seniors and adopting a tenant anti-harassment policy, followed by preserving existing affordable units on the SHI, using public land for affordable housing. Tied for number 5 were promoting and expanding the city's down payment assistance fund and exploring local requirements to prevent housing instability, like a notice of sale or rent. Next, establishing a housing and land acquisition program. And the last 3 actions were all tied. Building partnerships to maximize affordable housing production, promoting the DEI committee, and considering baseline requirements for sustainable development. The other main thing that we presented to folks and we asked about on the online open house was their preferences for different locations for potential new housing and also the types of housing that they think would make most sense in those locations. So we provided a map that has, general locations for all the city's neighborhoods, and we asked people to place up to 3 dots in the areas where they thought new housing should go. So when we ranked all of those dots, the number 1 location was Wallaston, followed by Quincy Center, South Quincy, North Quincy, and Crown Colony, with Norfolk Downs and Houseneck at the bottom of the list. But again, here we were just asking people kind of more generally about where they think new housing would make sense, not the kind of housing that they would want to see. That was the next question. So we asked for each neighborhood listed, people to select the type of housing that they think is most appropriate. And so this really runs the gamut across the range of densities. So you have things on the lower density spectrum, like single family homes and accessory dwelling units and cottage style housing, getting a little bit denser with 2-family homes, 3-family homes, and townhouses. And then, small multifamily, which is usually around, 4 to 9 units, mid-rise multifamily, that's, around like 5 or 6 stories, and then high-rise multifamily, which is usually like above 10 stories, I would say. And then also mixed use. So commercial uses on the first floor with residential uses above. So this very colorful chart basically shows the number of votes for the different kinds of housing types in each location. So the green boxes were the more popular things, the red were the less popular. And then for the column, the totals here, the darker grays were more popular, and the lighter grays were less popular. So these are, just comparing the totals, not all together. So we saw, generally highest preferences for single family across a lot of the neighborhoods, in particular, Marymount, Adams Shore, and Squantum, with kind of the denser communities, maybe denser neighborhoods being less appropriate. Another item that was tied was two-family homes, people feeling like those could fit in a lot of the neighborhoods. And the next item that folks had the most interest in seeing was townhouses. And, in particular, in some of the lower density neighborhoods like Adams Shore and Wollaston Hill. Of the different multifamily mixed use, there's definitely the most support for small multifamily. Again, not so much in some of those denser neighborhoods, but in more of like the mid-density neighborhoods that might be just outside of a, commercial or business district. And then in terms of some of those denser units, high-rise multifamily mixed use, people really feeling like those were inappropriate for a lot of locations, with the exception of Quincy Center, Marina Bay, Crown Colony, and a bit of Wollaston for the mixed use. And so, this was interesting, kind of seeing how some of the locations compared when people were just thinking very generally about where they thought new housing should go versus like more specifically thinking about these different development types. I just want to quickly run through the demographic information. We're always trying to ask for that when we're getting feedback to understand how the folks who are participating in this process align with the community as a whole and figure out if there's any gaps missing. So the majority of folks, just under 2/3 of people own their home, with a little less than 1/3 of people who rent their home. Some of the people who indicated other, we had some options around people living with family in a shelter. So, there are certainly folks that, don't rent or own their homes. In terms of the kind of housing that people live in, not surprisingly, the most people live in a single family home, but still you're seeing kind of a wide distribution across the unit spectrum, with the next most popular people living in two-family homes. We asked about age structure and how people identify in terms of racial and ethnic composition. So not surprisingly, usually in kind of a planning process, most of the people who participate are around middle age or older. These are people who are more likely to own property, are just kind of more invested in their community. So we saw the highest rates in terms of people 35 to 44 and 45 to 54. I don't think there was anyone who participated who was under the age of 25. A few people in that late 20s, early 30s category. About 3/4 of folks who participated identify as white. This was a question that people could select more than one. So some of the others in this category are people who identify as mixed race. So, not just one or only one race alone. The second highest category was Asian community. And, generally the rates of, non-white folks are higher in the community as a whole than on this survey. So we're definitely trying to think about that in terms of the equity standpoint. Most people that were participating have 2 people living in their household, followed by single person households. Most people who participated have lived in Quincy for over 21 years, which again is really not surprising. The longer that people live in a community, the more invested they're probably going to be. So, but quite a few people who participated that have only lived in the city for 3 to 10 years or 0 to 2 years. So it's always encouraging to see people, getting involved in these kind of processes, even if they haven't lived in the community for a long time. And then lastly, we asked if folks participated in any of the plan's engagement activities last winter, whether the online open house or the webinar, and most people had not, which was interesting. So, that means we were definitely kind of touching new people in this round of engagement versus the first round. All right. So our next section is around the Q&A. So as I mentioned earlier, if you could put your questions in the Q&A box, we will try to answer as many as we can, or go over any of the ones that have been answered. So I guess, Lydia, if you want to read out the question, and we can all respond.
Sure. Yeah. So we've been able to answer most questions as they've come in, since they've been relatively straightforward. So hopefully folks can see under the answered in the Q&A box, you should be able to see the ones that are answered. You might just have to uncollapse the answers if you can't see them. We do have one question. So it's around just an issue in Quincy, developers buying land, taking down the existing buildings and building larger apartments. And this really centers on the ability to get waivers. So Sean or Sherry, if you want to just touch on that, and if you want to have any comments on that front.
Well, regretfully, this is one of those issues where, although we are in the Department of Planning and Community Development, Sherry and I are not land use planners. We're community development planners. And, our colleagues on the planning side, they help in staffing the planning board, which is a board that's appointed by the mayor, and our planning director here, of course, in the office, advises that committee as well. But ultimately, city council typically holds community meetings on these issues, and then it goes to the board for a vote. So I'm really not at liberty to, address topics like that. But if anybody has an issue that they'd like to discuss, just with the planning director, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to answer that question. So in no way do I mean to not answer the question, but I don't feel like I, have the authority to really do that. And it's something that if somebody wants to provide feedback for the plan, we can certainly take that into account, but I can't answer that question.
And we do have representation from the planning side of PCD on our advisory committee.
There's no other open questions. Maybe you touched on everything, or people, there's no other open questions. I know maybe we can go to next steps, and then certainly if any other questions come up, put them in and we can address it.
Yes. And, anything that comes up after this meeting, our email addresses are on the Housing Quincy website, which I'll share on the last slide. And so please feel free, even after this meeting, to follow up with us, and we could try to capture those sentiments in the plan. All right. So this is really the last engagement that we're doing. Kind of capping a, almost year-long process, a little bit less. Following this webinar, we are going to work with the advisory committee to finalize our recommendations based on public input. So, really elevating those items that people had marked as their highest priorities, and potentially, maybe eliminating some items that didn't have much support and, just are not the highest priority for the next 5 years. From there, we're going to finalize and release the plan. It'll be a pretty long, comprehensive document. And so we plan to release that and probably shortly after come out with a more graphic friendly executive summary that if people don't want to read the whole plan, they can still get the gist of the content from that. The HPP has to be approved by the city council and the planning board via local adoption. That's required by the state statute. And from there, once it gets its local adoption, we will submit it to the Department of Housing and Community Development for approval. So that is sort of the official last step in this process. That's all I have here, but again, I just want to thank everybody for participating in this process. And if there's anything else you want to share with us, we still will be drafting the plan for a little bit longer. So happy to incorporate anything or, just talk if anyone has anything they feel like sharing. And here's the website for Housing Quincy. It's super easy. It's www.mapc.org/housing-Quincy. And that's where we post all of our resources. So after this meeting, we'll post the PDF of the presentation and also a recording. And that's where we also post some other resources where the final plan will live. So we'll continue using that website. All right. I think that's all, unless Sean or Sherry, you have anything you want to leave with?
I just put my contact in the chat in case anybody.
Oh, that's great.
If that person wanted to, send something to me, I can forward it to the planning director or anybody else. I'm happy to, forward things to the appropriate contacts they can be responded to, or I might be able to address others that might come in.
And I'm just putting my email address in the chat too, if you want to reach out. Otherwise, we just thank you for coming, and we look forward to sharing the final plan once it's complete.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.